We will now have Dr. Hanson's 15 minutes of rebuttal.
I think the best thing I can do is refer to this, that we were really talking about the origins of biological diversity, and I heard very little about that. It may indeed be that the creationist represented by Professor Lumsden is indeed a heretical one. I warn him, though, that I, by agreement, have to send this videotape to the Institution of Creation Research. Be that as it may, I felt that there was no answer to the chief criticisms I raised. I don't think thereby they were unimportant. We didn't hear how things are created. They were just told over and over again, yes, they were created. There were no predictions from that hypothesis, that theory, such that if such and such occurs, and there's, I think, nonsense to the notion, the what-if business, you really don't find that in textbooks, or not in any textbooks I've looked at, but we do see if A, then B. That is, if this is your theory, if things have been created, then what would we expect to see creation look like? The proposition I gave that indeed if they were all created at the same time, the maximum number should be existing at some time in the past, and then there would be some loss in that. There was absolutely no answer to that question there. There was no refutation, no confirmation, no correction or anything. I still think it's a legitimate question, and I heard nothing to it. What did I hear? There were a whole series of things, first of all, that I think were irrelevant in discussing the origin of life. Incidentally, as I met Professor Lumsden at the airport, I was not quite sure what he looked like, but I had a picture of him in the material he sent me. He had no picture of me. So I was a little bit ahead. It was up to me. What I really did see was this gentleman coming out of the gate holding a little book in front of him. I thought, my goodness, is that a creationist text? No, it turned out to be a book by Dawkins. What do you know, you in cosmic and biological evolution? It was The Blind Watchmaker. I thought that was a marvelous touch. But he says, well, it's interesting, but you know it's all wrong. I don't think anything he said showed that it was all wrong. And indeed, if you look at the section there in the origin of life, Dawkins answers very much just the kind of issue that Professor Lumsden posed. Not that we have created life, no. Not that we are committed irrevocably to some notion that there was a spontaneous formation of a gene that somehow got sequestered in lipid bilayers, and that was it. But there is no uptake of amino acids through such membranes and so forth. Rather, Dawkins spoke to the central issue. If life consists of living systems that take matter and energy from their environment to maintain themselves long enough to reproduce, what is the chance of something that complicated having arisen from non-living environment? You don't do, as was hinted here, just, oh, there's all that non-living stuff. What are the chances of it falling together? No, in fact, the old creationist, he's a new creationist, the old creationist said that that's an impossible event. The odds against all these different atoms falling together to form amino acids and amino acids proteins, or nucleotides forming DNA or RNA, that's so improbable that it couldn't happen. Lecomte de Nuit, Human Destiny, argued that way. Professor Lumsden is well aware that thermodynamically certain congeries, certain coming together of atoms are far more likely on thermodynamic grounds than others. Included is the fact in the Miller-Urey experiments that I'm sure he's familiar with, that you do get amino acids and you do get simple proteins forming spontaneously. You do get nucleotides. You do not get DNA. You do not yet get RNA. RNA is close. But as Dawkins points out, what you need to do is to go from the non-living, build up the molecules that are close to the living, and then ask yourself, now what is the probability of these falling together to make a living thing? And the Cairns experiments in there using clays were part of that. And there was no mention of the book, from the book that he waved at me, how that argument is ameliorated through that thinking. And if you look at Professor Morowitz's most recent book, the thing has been turned around to indeed you start with cells first, which provide an environment in which it is likely that the nucleic acids can be sequestered. The direction of the argument is the same, trying to get spontaneously formed objects that are close to the living thing so that the final step to living thing is not that improbable. But I repeat what I said earlier, we haven't done it yet. And I think all of that is somewhat irrelevant to what we're talking about. The other thing I want to talk to in the few minutes that are mine now is a curious order in which Professor Lumsden spent so much time saying that natural selection is not creative, it winnows. Yes, of course. And then finally at the end, separate from it, he brings in the fact that mutation is creative. Why didn't he put them together? The theory of natural selection does precisely that. There is an ongoing, unstoppable formation of mutations. They are, most of them, deleterious. I think I can give you a simple example that I use in class that agrees with him entirely, that most of them should be, predictably, are deleterious. And that is, give me your watch and let me jam a screwdriver in it on the chance that I can improve it. How many of you will let me do that? The point being that something as complicated as you and I am, if we have a random change introduced into us, which is a mutation, it is a change in base sequence, the vast majority of them are going to be deleterious. But don't forget that the mutations are always coming along. You can't stop them. And there is a certain finite probability. Maybe it's 1 in 6. I think it's even less than that. Where measurements have been done among some of the Swedish geneticists, it is thought that maybe only 1 in 100 could be thought to be of any sort of selective advantage. But they are always coming. And when we have, as we do within us, tens of thousands of genes, there is an enormous amount of new genetic information being formed each time a cell divides. And that's what natural selection acts on. You're right. It is the winnowing of natural selection that gets rid of those variations that are not adaptive and keeps those that are. And those that are present are continually forming new mutations all the time. Under those adaptive peaks that he showed us is not just a few genes, but are literally thousands and thousands of genes, including some that are deleterious. And the fact they're deleterious is covered by normal, non-deleterious genes. It may well be that under certain conditions, the deleterious ones are of advantage. And it is this whole business of natural populations being sequestered enormous genetic diversity that allows selection to act, and there are always new mutations coming in. To argue that that may just be happening and will change indeed from dark to light peppered moths is missing the whole point, that other mutations are occurring all the time, and that there are other things just than being soot on the trees that are part of living. And if you take that process and continue it on through the ages, there is a chance indeed that this will build up into different populations. As he said, if you get geographic isolation, you can get the differences. It's marvelous to hear a creationist agree with that notion of speciation. But why he stopped short there and didn't allow the process that he agrees happens to keep on going and result in yet more and yet more and yet more. And he finds it inconceivable that the differences could be familial differences, namely between different families or different orders or different classes. Recall the diversity of habitats that living things occupy. If you're trying to make the living as a tree, you will have very different selection pressures on you than if you're trying to make the living as an animal carnivorous predator. And in time, the differences that are selected, why couldn't they add up to these huge differences? He said nothing about one of the favorite problems with creationists, and that is how much time have we actually had? I think he's heretical if he's allowing me to get away with the fact that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Other creationists don't touch that and stay close to the 10,000. I would like him to address that and tell us actually where he stands on that. So I come back. What about the time we have? Think of the accumulation upon accumulation upon accumulation. In terms of natural selection, that is the mechanism of creation. How did that information get created there in the first place? There's nothing in terms of the creationist idea. He gave you no possible disproving, falsifying statement that's possible. That would be relevant to testing creationism in a thoroughly critical way. And I think he therefore has begged the essential issue that he is not testing creationism. He has made no attempt to show what could falsify it, in the sense then that he is refusing to test this, he is not behaving as a scientist, and the material he's talking about is not scientific.